Order. Gareth Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, kia ora. Mr Speaker, you can tell that Judith Collins is in trouble when all the National Party can do is talk about the Labour Party. I didn't hear any sort of cognizant defence of her, explanation, rationalisation. All I heard was a National Party flowing mud. All I saw was a party that could say, but Labour. Mr Speaker, that's why Judith Collins is in trouble, because the party can't even defend her. All they can do is throw mud. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to speak to the people of New Zealand, because what we saw in question time today was three parties throwing mud at each other. This is why young New Zealanders and many New Zealanders are turning off from our politics. They're sick of the scandals. They're sick of ministers not taking responsibility. They're sick of the conflict of interest we've seen numerous times. They want a different type of politics. Mr Speaker, we need to change the climate of politics. We need a good parliament that takes responsibility, acts transparently, and that's what the Green Party is going to champion. Mr Speaker, when you look at the Judith Collins case of which we're debating today, it's all over milk. Now, the minister early on last week had a cup of milk and said, "I drink milk. What's the scandal?" But, Mr Speaker, like a cup of milk left out in the sun, every day it started to smell a little bit more. Every day that sour, rancid smell has continued, and what we see is something smelly. It doesn't pass the Smith test. In fact, what we see is something rancid when it comes to this case. It stinks. Mr Speaker, this debate is around the minister's actions in China. This was a $36,600 taxpayer-funded trip. This was a minister who was invited. This wasn't a casual pop-in to the airport. This was a minister who was formally invited to visit a company of which her partner has a directorship. A clear and demonstrable business relationship between the minister and her spouse. We also saw the company Oravida on its website post what could be translated as an endorsement of their product. Mr Speaker, this is about perceptions and realities of conflict of interest. The minister's husband was a director. This was a company which donated $56,000 to the National Party. This is a company whose chief executive plays golf with the Prime Minister. This is a minister who this week, as that cup of milk started to smell more and more, has revealed that she also had dinner with Stone Chi. The Seven Veils, Miss King says. What we know is that as more detail has come out, it's got smellier and smellier. Mr Speaker, John Key today said of Miss Collins he was very disappointed in her. He said she had handled the situation very poorly, and she says that she got it wrong. Now, Mr Speaker, we've seen a conflict of interest. The National Party's own saying a perception. I believe it's a clear conflict of interest that the minister should have disclosed, but the questions for the government have to be, why won't they release the Cabinet advice? If they want to clear this up, if they want to clear the air, they should be releasing the advice. Why did the minister, who sought approval for her husband to travel with her, decide not to? Was advice offered to her and her husband? These are the critical questions this government has to ask, because what we have here is a senior, very experienced minister of obvious legal training who's breached cabinet rules, clearly breached cabinet rules with a conflict of interest. It's critically important that particularly ministers of the Crown are held to a high standard. Mr Speaker, when it comes to business interests, we don't want our ministers out advertising, promoting, shilling for corporate brands. We want integrity in our politics. We want conflicts of interest where they arise disclosed and managed responsibly. Other New Zealand businesses rightfully feel that they're not on a level playing field. They're not getting a fair go because of this government's relationships with certain corporates. Now, it's not just Oravida or the Prime Minister playing golf with Stone Chi. You can see it in the Bathurst case. You can see it with the secret meetings over Sky City. You can see it with the Prime Minister taking time out the day before the last general election to have a meeting with Anadarko, Big Oil, who's just left the country. Mr Speaker, What this country needs is a government that's going to focus on real people and real Kiwi businesses. Not just the choruses, the TYs, the Anadarkos, real people, real Kiwi businesses. But, Mr. Speaker, while this debate is about Judith Collins, the buck stops with John Key. He's the Prime Minister. He's the one who defended her initially, but now backtracking. The buck stops with Key. Remember when Key, before he became Prime Minister, said he would bring a higher standard to ministers and politics? Do you remember when he said that? But do you remember also when he forgot that? When it became to the discredited ACT leader, John Banks. When it came to Peter Dunn, who still won't give a categorical assurance he was not the leaker, and you see it with the dance of the Seven Veils when it comes to Colin Craig and some of his far-out views. What we need is transparency. What we need is better management of conflicts of interest when they arise. But what we need is a Prime Minister who's going to take responsibility, who's not going to pass the buck, who's going to stand up and demand that the minister is held accountable. Now, I recall early on when Key was still talking about a higher standard, we saw the Pansy Wong case, which has some parallels with what we see here. What we need is answers and responsibility, because what we're talking about is taxpayers' money and the status and the role and responsibilities of ministers. Now, what I want to see is ministers, no matter what political affiliation they hark to, is ministers who can handle conflict of interest, who can stand on the New Zealand and world stage with integrity, who aren't putting special corporate business interests first, where every New Zealander or every New Zealand company knows they're going to get the same hearing from the minister because they're an individual, not because they donate to a particular party, not because they're married to a particular person, not because they play golf with the Prime Minister. Every New Zealander and every New Zealand company is going to get a fair go. That's what I believe New Zealanders want, and that's what I believe we should feel proud of. One of the least corrupt countries in the world, but we can't just stand by while this type of activity happens. We need to keep fighting for higher standards and holding ministers to account when they breach those rules. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish with two solutions. Hopefully we can learn from this. What we need is better lobbying disclosure regime. This is something the Green Party has championed. It's something we are now pushing through the Standing Orders Review. What we need is a better regime when business lobbyists are lobbying ministers or MPs. Secondly, while there's been some reform around electoral donations, there's more that needs to be done. We need greater transparency so the public, when they see us in this House, can feel confident knowing who has contributed to their party or to their electorate campaign. Because every New Zealander has the right to have confidence in their elected officials to serve in the country's interest, not in the corporate interest or a particular company's interest. Mr. Speaker, something is smelly, something is rancid when it comes to this, and I just hope the government can show some responsibility, take responsibility and answer the critical questions we have before us. Kia ora.
Speaker.
Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, there is a